So God is writing his story in you. He's an amazing God. It's an amazing story. And as God writes our story, here's what we got to know. What we do today matters for tomorrow. Our actions impact the people around us, especially our children and grandchildren. No one lives on an island. No one lives within themselves. Our lives and our legacy, for good or bad, spreads to future generations. Bible scholar Alan Ross says that, quote, this is a fundamental principle in God's economy, that the actions of individuals affect the lives of their descendants. This pattern is clear in the patriarchal narratives, what we've been reading in Genesis, for the deeds and dispositions of the patriarchs were passed on in one way or another to their children. All right, so in today's passage, Genesis 49, we're going to consider Jacob's prophecy over his sons, who became the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, at this point, Jacob is near death. He's physically blind, but he is seeing the future through faith. It's as if he's looking through the eyes of his mind. Genesis 48, 21, 22 said this, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the land of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. Now, don't miss Jacob's faith in this passage. He clung to the promises of the covenant God made to Abraham and repeated to Isaac and then repeated to him. God repeated that covenant over and over in Genesis. We saw it in Genesis 12. We saw the Abrahamic covenant. Genesis 12, Genesis 13, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Genesis 22. And one day, Israel is going to possess the promised land. When Israel took over the land, Jacob pledged to Joseph a portion of the land conquered from the Amorites. Now, we don't know of where that land was. No passage details the battle. We know where the land was, but no passage details the battle of the Amorites, who lived actually in the hill country of Canaan. However, Jacob seized the land and built a well there. Don't forget that. Jacob seized the land and he built a well there. In Hebrews, Jacob uses a play on, in the Hebrew language, he uses a play on words. In the Hebrew language, the word translated mountain slope, he says to Joseph, I'm going to give you a mountain slope area. That's the word Shechem. It means a portion of land. The Shechem, a portion of land, is in the area named Shechem. So Jacob promises Joseph a Shechem, a portion of land in Shechem. You probably didn't need to know that, but I just thought that was kind of interesting, right? Shechem and Shechem. All right, so 400 years later, when the Israelites carried Joseph's bones from Egypt to the promised land, he was buried in Shechem to fulfill that promise. Now, one more thing. I think this is amazing. The Gospel of John refers to this passage. 1,800 years after Jacob's promise, Jesus came to the town of Samaria in Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph, Scripture says. Jacob's well was there, so Joseph, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting by the well. Now, at that well, Jesus offered forgiveness to an adulterous woman, and she recognized him as the Messiah, the one God promised would crush Satan's head, back in Genesis 3:15. Amazing, right? Another reminder. So here we are reading about Jacob, the land that he got from the Amorites, the land he gives to Joseph. He built a well there. And then in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 4, Jesus meets this woman by Jacob's well. So another reminder how important Genesis is to understanding the whole Bible. All right, so in Genesis 49, Moses writes about Jacob's deathbed prophecies. The dying patriarch, he gathered his sons around him, and he tells them what their future will be. And I'm just going to hit the highlights of Jacob's prophecy about his sons. You can read the whole chapter, and I'll ask you to do that. But let's look at the prophecies of his sons. So Reuben, Genesis 49, 3 and 4. Reuben was Jacob's firstborn, but he said Reuben is unstable as water and gave into his impulses by sleeping with Jacob's concubine Bilhah back in Genesis 35. So he would not receive the dignity and power of the firstborn. The clans of Reuben, in Judges, the clans of Reuben are characterized by their indecision. In chapter 49, verses 5 and 7, Simeon and Levi. Jacob describes Simeon and Levi as weapons of violence. That depiction refers to them. Remember when their sister Dinah was raped back in Genesis 35? They went to the men of Shechem and they said, hey, we'll intermarry with you if you guys will be circumcised. And then when the men of Shechem were circumcised, at the third day, when they were most sore and unable to do anything, they massacred them. Remember that story? In their anger, they killed men and hamstrung oxen. And Jacob described what they did as cruel. The tribe of Judah eventually absorbed the tribe of Simeon. But on the other hand, it's interesting that Levi was honored as a priestly tribe. All right, that's Simeon and Levi. Judah's next, but we're going to save Judah to last. Zebulun and Issachar is the next one. Zebulun, and verses 13 and 14, would be enriched by sea trade, though they didn't border water. They were between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee. We read about that in Joshua 19, 10 and 11. And Issachar was in a fertile area and was often the subject of invading armies. They said, although strong as a donkey, the tribe was forced to work for others. The prophecy of Dan. The tribe of Dan, this is in verse 16 and 17, the tribe of Dan did not fulfill their calling. They were supposed to be the tribe of righteous judges. However, they were described more like dangerous snakes on the roadside. That's what Jacob says. During the time of the judges, they were the first to practice idolatry. Judges 18:30. In verse 18, Jacob kind of pauses to request God's work in a sense. It's like he's doing all these prophecies and then he just stops and asks God to work in his family. In verse 19, he talks about Gad. Gad, he says, will be attacked and will attack others. This tribe settled east of the Jordan and often experienced raids. We read about that in 1 Chronicles 5, 18, 19. The next tribe mentioned is Asher. The tribe of Asher settled in Galilee. This is in Genesis 49:20. They settled in the Galilee in the northern part of Israel, and this area was famous for fertile land and vegetation. Naphtali is the next one. Naphtali settled northwest of the Sea of Galilee. Deborah, in Judges, Deborah sang a song of them risking their lives on the heights of the fields. Joseph is mentioned in verses 22 through 26. Now, Joseph is a prince among his brothers. He's incredibly blessed by Jacob's prophecy. His tribe is doubly blessed, remember, through his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Both are like the other brothers. Joseph gets a double inheritance. Joseph, remember, in his life, he was attacked, shot at, he's harassed. That's what this passage says. He was attacked, shot at, harassed, but God protected him. And then this passage, it's amazing. When you read through it, God is described as the mighty one of Jacob. He's described as the shepherd. He's described as the stone or the rock of Israel, the God of your fathers. He's described as the Almighty. Although brothers attacked Joseph, God protected him, and he led him, and he shepherded him throughout his life. Verse 27, Benjamin. Jacob portrayed Benjamin as a ravenous wolf, devouring prey and dividing the spoil. This tribe occupied, the tribe of Benjamin occupied the land between Ephraim and Judah. And some describe this area as a kind of a war zone in Israel's history. And the Benjamites became like a warlike tribe. We read about that in 1 Kings 12 and 2 Chronicles 14. Now, it's interesting, King Saul in the Old Testament and then the Apostle Paul were all descendants of Benjamin. All right, let's wrap up this chapter by circling back to Judah. We follow Judah in Genesis 38 on a detour from God. He mistreated his daughter-in-law Tamar, and then he tricked her into having She tricked him, rather, into having a child with her. Tamar tricked her father-in-law into having a child with her. You can go back and read about that in Genesis 38. But by God's grace, he rules over our pasts. And Jacob says that Judah will be praised by his brothers and will rule over them. Judah's prominence will produce two kings. David will go through the line of Judah. Solomon will be through the line of Judah. And it says this in Genesis 49:10, the ruler's scepter shall not depart from Judah. From King David's descendants, who's going to come? Jesus, right? The Messiah. The one God said would crush Satan's head. Genesis 3:15. Jesus is going to come through Judah. In this passage, it says Judah is like a lion's cub, and the tribe of Judah takes on that name. Jesus will be called the Lion of Judah. Revelation 5:5. Bible scholar Alan Ross says that Jacob's prophecy pivots on the word until in Genesis 49, verse 10. Until one comes. Until Jesus comes. This tribute will come to Jesus, and to him shall be the obedience of all the people. In this passage, when you read it, many scholars believe that the abundance of crops and the grapes that are named in this passage describe the millennial kingdom. And during that time, there'll be like a paradise-like splendor on earth. One commentator says this about Genesis 49, 11, and 12. It speaks of exuberant, intoxicating abundance. It is the golden age of the coming one whose universal rule will be recognized. Amazing, isn't it? Amazing. Jacob's prophecies about Jesus and his rule on the earth comes from his deathbed. Jacob, on his deathbed, tells us about Jesus. Now, much is going to happen before then, but one day, Genesis 49, 11, and 12 will be fully recognized. Jesus will come through the line of Judah. Amazing, amazing prophecy in Genesis 49. All right, so read Genesis 49. Go back and look at the brothers, the tribe, the 12 tribes.